So, in this difficult passage from the prophet Jeremiah, God announces that he will bring pagan peoples into the land of Judah and Jerusalem to utterly destroy it, to make an end of it. But we need to remember, what is God making an end of? Well, we heard yesterday, God is making an end to the bad figs. He's making an end to a people who call themselves the people of God, but refuse to live, in a sense, in the way of that God laid out for them, in the way of justice, in the way of mercy, in the way of caring for the poor, in the way of worshiping God alone and trusting in his power as they try to negotiate between what they think are superpowers, Egypt on the one hand and Babylon on the other. And they think that, in a sense, if they can just outsmart this situation, they'll be able to come out on top somehow, and the glories of Solomon's kingdom will somehow be restored to them. But the word that the Lord gives to the prophet Jeremiah is, God isn't interested in restoring the glories of Solomon's kingdom. He's interested, in a sense, interested if you use that word, in a sense, God's desire is to form a people that will reflect his glory, not in earthly, political, military, economic power, but reflect his glory in how the community treats those who are weakest among them, how the community identifies itself as that which is dependent upon God alone for its life. And to that end, God is going to wipe away everything that is an obstacle to his people becoming completely dependent upon him. And that means the temple, the city of Jerusalem, the remnants of the monarchy, the cadet branch of the monarchy that has been put in the throne as a puppet regime by the Babylonians. God's going to wipe all that away. So there's nothing left for the Israelites to hope for except God. And God is going to have them in the exile for 70 years. Through the prophet Jeremiah, he's just going to be 70 years, and go figure, the exile lasts about 70 years until the Persians come and do to the Babylonians what the Babylonians have been doing to everybody else. Has God spoke through the prophet Jeremiah. That's why that's why we have the words of the prophet Jeremiah, because actually the things he said wound up coming true. They thought, oh, we ought to keep this. This was a good word. This actually came true. And the word for us in the prophet Jeremiah during this time of Lent, as we begin to walk the way of the cross in a much more intense and intentional way, is that we are called to, in a sense, do that work of allowing God to, in a sense, take away anything that prevents us from trusting in him completely, anything that keeps us, any obstacles in our own hearts to showing mercy, obstacles to forgiveness, obstacles to being those who are channels of his love and justice. And we need to allow God to wipe that away. And in the moment in which the things that happen to us in this life that take those things away, we may think those are our enemies, that we're being, but ultimately, in the hindsight of those who trust in God's grace and look back upon their lives and see how God was working even when they could not see, even working through their enemies, that God can bring forward life out of that death. And therefore, even those things that seem to be our enemies are transformed into God's servants. Again, in the moment, Israel is suffering, and Jeremiah is right there suffering with him. He's not holding himself aloof. He's in the city of Jerusalem. He is suffering with his people. But he's saying, what Jeremiah is saying is that in the midst of this suffering, God is working to bring something fundamentally new, radically new, that will be eternal, that will abide forever. And this word ultimately comes true in the person of Jesus, who suffers the sins of his people, who takes his people's separation from God into himself, so that he can bring all of us in to that new place, and so that he can destroy the power of death. He can destroy the power of death, that Pharaoh, that Nebuchadnezzar, that eternal oppressor. But death's power is broken in Jesus. And in a sense, Jesus does to death what death has been doing to everybody else. He destroys it. He brings death to death. And in doing so, opens up a new way, a new chapter, a new age for all those who are willing to trust in God's love and triumph. A reading from the prophet Jeremiah. Thus says the Lord of hosts, because you have not obeyed my words, I am going to send for all the tribes of the north, says the Lord, even for King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, my servant, and I will bring them against this land and its inhabitants, and against all these nations around. I will utterly destroy them, and make them an object of horror and of hissing, and an everlasting disgrace. And I will banish from them the sound of mirth and the sound of gladness, the sound of the bridegroom and the voice of the bride, the sound of the millstones and the light of the lamp. This whole land shall become a ruin and a waste, and these nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. Then, after 70 years are completed, I will punish the king of Babylon and that nation, the land of the Chaldeans, for their iniquity, says the Lord, making the land an everlasting waste. I will bring upon that land all the words that I have uttered against it, everything written in this book, which Jeremiah prophesied against all the nations. For many nations and great kings shall make slaves of them also. I will repay them according to their deeds and the work of their hands. For thus the Lord, the God of Israel, said to me, take from my hand this cup of the wine of wrath, and make all the nations to whom I send you drink it. They shall drink and stagger and go out of their minds because of the sword that I am sending among them. So I took the cup from the Lord's hand, and made all the nations to whom the Lord sent me drink it. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.